Shalom Aleichem, Na'aleh viewers. Today's shiur is dedicated Lili Nishmas, Rochalei Bas Reb Chaim Tzvi. We're continuing in Mitzvot Brachot in the Gemara Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, in the beginning of the second parak. We were discussing in the previous shiur the Machlokes Rishonim, how to understand the Gemara, the very first sugya, the beginning of the second parak. The Mishnah cites the first halacha, and the Mishnah is Haya Kori B'Torah, that if an individual was reciting the Torah, he was reading from the Torah, V'higia Zman HaMikra, and by chance he happened to be reciting the paragraphs of Kriya Shema from the Sefer Torah, from the Torah scroll, and it coincided with the time to recite the Shema, the Mishnah states in Kivein Libo, if this individual had intentions as he was reading, yotzeh, he fulfills his obligation. So the Gemara on that comments, says the Gemara, Shema Mino, the very beginning of the Gemara, on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, says the Gemara, Shema Mino, we can infer from here, Mitzvot Tzrichot Kavana. This Mishnah seems to be consistent with the opinion that holds that in order to perform a mitzvah, one has to have intentions, one has to have kavana, one has to have in mind that he's performing a mitzvah and is engaged in the action of the mitzvah with the intention of fulfilling a mitzvah in order to fulfill the mitzvah. Because the Gemara understood that when the Mishnah says in Kivein Libo, if this individual has in mind, he fulfills his obligation, what's the intention that we are discussing? What kind of intent is it necessary to have when one is learning from the Sefer Torah and reading the parashiyos of Shema, the paragraphs of Kriya Shema? If he has intention, he fulfills his obligation. The Gemara assumed that the intention that we are referring to is the intention of performing a mitzvah, fulfilling a mitzvah. And that supports the opinion that holds throughout Shas, that Mitzvot Tzrichot Kavana, that mitzvahs require intent. So the Gemara answers no. Says the Gemara, you can't prove from our Mishnah that we hold in general Mitzvot Tzrichot Kavana. Mayim Kivein Liboy, what does it mean if this individual had intention, he performs the mitzvah in Kivein Liboy Likrois? It means if he had in mind that he is reading, he has to have in mind to read. So the Gemara asks, Likrois, what do you mean he has to have in mind to read? He's engaged in reading. What intention is necessary? He's doing the action of reading from the Sefer Torah, the paragraphs of Shema. So the Gemara answers, the Mishnah is coming to exclude a scenario where the individual was reading just to proofread. He wasn't reading with the kavana of reading, he was just looking it over, he was proofreading to make sure that the text was written properly. So in that case he does not fulfill his obligation. But if he had in mind to read, even if he didn't have in mind to perform a mitzvah, he fulfills his obligation. So we saw in the previous shiurim, I believe in the last year, that there's a machlokes rishonim, a three-way machlokes rishonim, how to understand the Gemara over here. What exactly is the flaw if an individual was reading the Shema from a Sefer Torah and he was only proofreading? He was reading it b'koirei lahagia. He was reading it just to proofread the text of the Sefer Torah. Why in that scenario does he not fulfill the mitzvah of reciting Kriya Shema? Rashi learns that the reason is that we are concerned this is not considered a ma'aseh kriya. According to Rashi, this has a halacha of a mesasek. It's as though he's unaware of what he's doing, even though actually he is aware in this particular case, but it has the halachic status of a mesasek, of an individual that does an action without awareness. The halacha of a mesasek is that we view the action as occurring by itself. The action does not relate, it's not connected to the individual, unless you have a certain level of das, a certain level of knowledge. So Rashi understands that the halacha of koirei lahagia is a din that he's considered a misasek He's considered a person who did the action in a state of unawareness. It's as though he was unaware, and the act of reading is not connected to the reader. So the Mishnah says that one has to have intention to read. That means one has to have in mind that he's engaged in an act of reading, in order that we can connect that ma'aseh kriya, the act of reading, to the reader. And this way he's considered to have performed a ma'aseh kriya, performed an act of reading the Shema, of reciting the Shema, and then he fulfills his obligation. That's how Rashi learns the Gemara, as opposed to if he didn't have in mind at all to read, then he doesn't fulfill his obligation. If he has in mind to read, he fulfills the mitzvah. He doesn't have in mind, he does not fulfill the mitzvah. But according to